I have known Alastair Care since we were boys at Oxford, flinging ink pots at each other across a shared table, and in 30 years I never once saw him lose an argument until his own grandmother beat him at his own dinner table without raising her voice above a murmur. That is the story I mean to tell, because I was there for every hand she played, and because a man who watched the Duke of Duncraig fall in love against his own iron will deserves, I think, to say so before he dies. It began with a letter. I was staying at Castle Carrach that autumn, as I did most autumns, ostensibly to shoot grouse, and actually to keep Alastair from brooding himself into a stone effigy of his own ancestors. He had refused, that year alone, 4 separate brides put before him by 4 separate mothers, each refusal delivered with the same flat courtesy, the same closed door. Society called him the Highland Duke, and said it the way one says the name of whether one cannot argue with the coldest man north of Edinburgh, they said, married only to his ledgers and his grief. His father had died young. His young sister had died younger, leaving behind a small girl, Flora, whom Alastair had taken in without a word of complaint, and raised behind the walls of Carrach like a secret he was frightened to lose. Carrach itself did nothing to soften the county's opinion of him. It was a great grey pile of a castle above a loch that turned the color of hammered iron on all but the rare days the sun troubled to show itself, and Alastair had let its public rooms go dim and its fires burn low since his father's funeral, as though warmth were an indulgence he had decided he no longer deserved. The mothers of the district had tried everything on him in 5 years of determined siege. A shy poetess from Inverness who wept when he did not answer her verses in kind, a general's daughter who rode to hounds better than any man in the glen, and told him so at every opportunity, an heiress from Edinburgh whose father owned half the shipping between there and Leith, and who spoke of Alastair's rentroll before she had once asked after his health. He had been unfailingly civil to every one of them and unmoved by all of them, until the district had settled, with the particular cruelty small places reserve for men who will not do as they're told, on calling him cold rather than grieving, because cold required no sympathy and grieving might have asked something of them. The letter came from his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, who lived at the Dower House 2 miles down the glen and who wrote to her grandson roughly as often as the tide comes in, that is to say, without fail and without asking permission. "I have engaged a new governess for Flora," it said. "She arrives Tuesday. You will dine with us Thursday to approve of her, though you have no say in the matter, as I have already decided you will." Alastair read this aloud to me at breakfast, and set it down with the particular disgust of a man who has been managed his whole life and resents that it still works. "She thinks I don't see what she's doing," he said. "What is she doing?" "She is doing what she has done since I was 21. She is auditioning wives." He said the word like it tasted of vinegar. "A governess, Thomas. My grandmother has taken to interviewing prospective duchesses and dressing them as servants, so I cannot object on the grounds of ambition." "That seems like a great deal of trouble to go to." "You have not met my grandmother." I had in fact met his grandmother a dozen times, and I did not think for a moment that Alastair had guessed the whole of her scheme, because if he had, he would have dismissed the governess before her trunk was off the cart. He believed, with the confidence of a man who has never once been outmaneuvered by a woman he loves, that he could sit through one dinner, be unfailingly correct, and return to his ledgers unmoved. I confess I believed something closer to what happened. Miss Wren Calloway arrived on the Tuesday coach with 1 trunk, 1 hat-box, and a composure that the housekeeper later told me unsettled the whole staff, because girls arriving to serve in a duke's household generally arrive either terrified or grasping, and Miss Calloway was neither. She was perhaps 24, plainly dressed in grey wool that had been let out at the hem more than once, with dark hair pinned without fuss and a steadiness in her eyes that made the footman forget, halfway through announcing her, what he had meant to say. I did not see her arrive. I heard about it within the hour, because in a house that quiet, everything is heard within the hour. What I did see, 2 days later, was Flora at the schoolroom window, laughing, actually laughing. A sound I had not heard from that child in the 18 months since her mother's funeral, at something her new governess had said about the particular indignity of Latin verbs. I stood in the corridor and listened longer than was polite, and when I told Alastair of it that evening, over the whiskey he poured too fast when he was uneasy, he only said, "Good. That's what she's paid for," and changed the subject with the transparent haste of a man protecting something. Thursday's dinner was meant, on its surface, to be an interview, the Dowager presiding, Alastair presiding over his own discomfort, and Miss Calloway presiding. I would come to learn, over the two of them without either man or grandmother noticing she was doing it. I was invited because Alastair could not face his grandmother's dinners alone, a fact he would have denied under torture. She came down in the same gray wool, unapologetic about it, and took the chair the Dowager indicated with the unhurried grace of a woman who has decided, somewhere along the road of her life, that she will not be made small by other people's opinion of her worsted dress. Alastair rose because he had been raised to rise, said good evening because he had been raised to say it, and then spent the soup course in a silence so pointed that his grandmother finally set down her spoon and said, "Alastair, you will ask Miss Calloway a question, or I will begin to think you were not taught manners, and I know for a fact that I taught them to you myself." "Miss Calloway," he said, in the voice he used on tenants who owed rent, "I understand you come from Perthshire." "I do, your grace. My father was the parish schoolmaster. He believed a girl's mind wanted exercise as much as a boy's, which put him at odds with most of the parish, and at ease with almost no one, myself included, until I was old enough to be glad of it." "And you left him for this?" "He died, your grace, 3 years past. I left for the reason most governesses leave anywhere, because a woman with a good mind and no fortune has very few doors, and I intended to walk through the ones that opened rather than weep at the ones that didn't." I watched something move behind Alastair's eyes, not softening yet, but attention, the particular attention of a man who has been served a great many polite lies at that table and has just, for the first time in months, been served the truth instead. "That is a hard philosophy," he said. "It is a useful one. Hard and useful are not always at odds, your grace, though I notice they're often confused for one another in this country." She said it lightly, without the flirtation of a woman angling for notice, and without the meekness of one hoping to be overlooked, and I saw the Dowager's mouth twitch with something she did not let reach her eyes. Alastair had no answer ready for that, which I had rarely seen in my life, and covered it by asking after Flora's progress in her lessons, a subject on which Miss Calloway spoke for the next quarter hour with such plain, unforced affection for the child that even I, a confirmed bachelor with no interest in schoolrooms, found myself charmed. Alastair listened more than he spoke. I marked it because it was so unlike him, and because his grandmother marked it too, with the satisfaction of a woman watching a fish approach a hook it does not yet know is baited. Walking back to the castle that night, under a sky so thick with stars it looked, Alastair said, like a spilled jewel box, he told me flatly, "She is unsuitable for governess. For whatever my grandmother has in mind, she has opinions. You just praised her for a quarter of an hour." I asked civil questions about my ward's education. "That is not the same thing." He walked faster, as he always did when he wished a conversation to end before it had properly begun, and I let him get 10 paces ahead before I said, mostly to myself, that I had never in 30 years seen him walk fast away from a woman he found unremarkable. 2 days after that dinner, Alastair found what he told me was a purely administrative reason to visit the schoolroom, Flora's Latin. He said, wanted his supervision, though he had not supervised a Latin lesson in his life. He found Miss Calloway instead teaching the child long division on a slate, and beyond it, sums involving acreage and rent and the price of wool per stone, and he stood in the doorway a full minute before he said, with the particular authority of a man unused to being questioned in his own house, "Miss Calloway, my niece is 8 years old. I fail to see what use she has for a rent ledger." "She has every use for it, Your Grace, unless you intend to marry her to a man who will keep her ignorant of her own household's accounts her whole life, which I confess I hope you do not." She did not look up from the slate. "Flora will one day be mistress of some house or other, grand or humble, and a woman who cannot read a ledger is a woman entirely dependent on the honesty of whoever hands it to her. I have met few men, in my experience, worth that particular gamble." "You think rather poorly of my sex." "I think accurately of arithmetic, Your Grace, which does not care what sex does the summing. If I have offended you, I will teach her Ovid instead, and let her discover the cost of her own candles the hard way, as most gently bred women are made to." There was the faintest thread of humor under it, not quite a challenge, not quite a jest, and Flora looked between the two of them with the frank interest of a child who senses a game being played by adults too proud to admit they are playing it. Alasdair was silent long enough that I, watching from the corridor with no more excuse to be there than he had, thought he might simply leave without answering at all. Instead, he crossed to the table, picked up the slate, and studied the sum. Flora had worked with the slow attention he ordinarily gave his own factors' accounts. "She has carried the 4 wrong," he said finally. "She has. I was about to tell her so when you interrupted us, Your Grace." "Then I will leave you to it." But he did not leave at once, and when he did, he left with a look on his face I had not seen there before, not quite admiration, not quite discomfort, but the particular unsettled expression of a man who has gone looking for a reason to disapprove of someone and come away instead with none. The next weeks, I watched the dowager work with the patient cruelty of a woman who loves her grandson too much to let him waste his life alone. She did not throw Miss Calloway at him. She was subtler than that, and far more dangerous. She simply arranged, with the innocent regularity of the seasons, for their paths to cross. A walk to the dower house that required passing the schoolroom garden at precisely the hour Flora and her governess took their afternoon air. A dinner invitation that always, through some accident of arithmetic, left the table one lady short unless Miss Calloway was asked to make up the number. A request that Alasdair review Flora's copybook, which meant Alasdair sitting at the schoolroom table with Miss Calloway beside him, her sleeve nearly brushing his as she pointed out where the child had improved. I do not think Alasdair saw the pattern at first. He was a man who managed an estate the size of a small country and did it well, but he had never had to defend himself against his own grandmother's patience, because he had never before given her reason to deploy the whole of it. There was, too, the matter of the Michaelmas fair, held every year on the flat ground below the kirk, where the tenants sold their late lambs and their preserves and their small carved things, and where the dowager had for years dragged her grandson for exactly 1 hour of dutiful appearance before he escaped back to his ledgers. That year she announced, over breakfast, that Flora ought to see the fair properly this time, and that Miss Calloway would of course accompany her, and that Alasdair, having nothing better to do with his morning, might as well walk with them rather than trail behind like a man attending his own funeral. He walked with them. I came along as well, mostly to watch, and I watched Flora vanish twice into the crowd around the sweet stall and the fortune-teller's tent, and I watched Miss Calloway laugh, honestly and without artifice, at a piper who played badly and knew it, and played on regardless out of what he called professional stubbornness. Alasdair bought Flora a ribbon she did not ask for and pretended, when Miss Calloway noticed, that it had been an accident of the stall being in his path. It was in the press near the horse ring that Flora slipped her governess's hand, drawn off by a litter of collie pups behind a fence, and was gone long enough, perhaps 3 minutes, no more, that both adults went the particular gray color of parents who have misplaced a child in a crowd of strangers. I have never seen Alasdair move as fast as he moved through that fair, nor Miss Calloway, and they found her at the same moment, from opposite directions, kneeling perfectly contentedly in the straw with a pup in her lap, and no notion at all that she had caused alarm. "You must not do that," Miss Calloway said, crouching to the child's level, her voice not angry but very close to breaking. "You must never leave my hand in a crowd, Flora, not ever. Do you understand me?" "I am sorry," Flora said, startled by the tears she had clearly not expected to cause, and Alasdair, who had gone to one knee beside them both without seeming to notice he had done it, put one hand briefly, lightly on Miss Calloway's shoulder, the first time, I believe, he had touched her at all, and said, "Lo, she is found. She is safe. You did nothing wrong." It was not clear from his tone whether he spoke to the child or to the governess, and I do not think it was entirely clear to him either. The turning came, as these things do in a storm. It was late in October, and Alasdair had ridden out at midday to see to a flooded tenant farm on the far side of the glen, taking only a groom with him, and I was at the castle with Flora and Miss Calloway when the sky went the color of a bruise, and the rain came down sideways with a violence that stripped the last leaves from the rowans in under an hour. Word came at dusk, garbled and worse for the telling, the bridge at Kilmuir washed out, the Duke's horse come home lame and riderless, no sign of him on the road. I have never, before or since, seen a room go so quiet. Flora, who was 8 and old enough to understand what a riderless horse could mean, began to cry without a sound, the worst kind of crying, and it was Miss Calloway. Not I, not the housekeeper, not the dowager, who was sent for at once and would take the better part of an hour to arrive down a flooding road, who knelt on the schoolroom floor in her plain gray dress, and gathered the child against her, and said, in a voice that did not shake though her hands, I noticed, were white-knuckled on the child's shoulders, "Your uncle has crossed worse rivers than this one, on worse nights, coming home to you. He is not done with this world yet, Flora, and neither is it done with him. We will wait together, and we will not weep before we know there is cause." I went out with the men, and a lantern that the wind kept trying to steal from my hand, the rain coming so hard against my face that I could scarcely tell which way the road ran, and we shouted his name into the dark for the better part of 2 hours with no answer but the roar of the swollen burn. I will admit to you now, though I did not admit it then, that I had begun to imagine how I would tell Flora, and how I would tell his grandmother, and had got no further than the first sentence of either speech before I made myself stop imagining it at all. We found him at last past midnight, on the wrong side of the washed bridge, having swum his horse across a channel he ought by rights not to have survived, walking the last 2 miles on a wrenched ankle rather than wait out the storm like a sensible man, because, he told me later, grudgingly, as though the admission cost him something, he had thought of Flora crying and could not make himself sit still on the wrong bank of a river while she did it. We brought him in soaked to the skin and gray with cold, and it was Miss Calloway who had the good sense, before the housekeeper could fuss him into a chair by the fire and stand over him wringing her hands, to send for dry blankets and hot broth, and to keep Flora, who had bolted down the stairs the moment she heard his voice in the hall, from throwing her whole small weight against his bruised ankle in her relief. She managed the room the way a good governess manages a schoolroom in chaos, without seeming to manage it at all, and Alasdair, sitting wrapped in blankets with his niece asleep against his shoulder within the half-hour, watched her do it with an expression I had not seen on his face since before his sister died. "You did well tonight," he said to her low, when he thought no one else was listening. I was listening. A man in my position learns to be very good at appearing not to. "I did what anyone would do, Your Grace." "No," he said, "you did not. Anyone would have wept or fussed or lost their head. You did not do any of those things, and my niece will sleep tonight because you didn't." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly required by courtesy. "I am in your debt. You owe me nothing but my wages, sir, and those are already agreed." But she said it gently, and there was color in her face that had not been put there by the fire, and I thought, watching them, that whatever Alastair believed he had decided about Miss Calloway, some other part of him had already decided something quite different, and was simply waiting for the rest of him to catch up. He did not catch up quickly. That is the truest thing I can say of my friend. He was a man who fought his own heart the way he fought everything, by main force and cold reason, and both had always served him before. He told himself, over the weeks that followed, that his gratitude was ordinary, that his attention to Flora's lessons was merely diligence, that he found reasons to be in the schoolroom because a guardian ought to take interest in his ward, and not because he had begun, without quite admitting it, to arrange his whole day around the hour Miss Calloway read poetry aloud by the window while Flora practiced her letters. His grandmother, of course, saw exactly what was happening and grew bolder for it. It was in November that Lady Constance Pride arrived at Carrick. Invited, the Dowager swore up and down, entirely at the request of Constance's own mother, an old friend from the Dowager's girlhood, and not at all because Constance was a viscount's daughter of excellent fortune and unimpeachable birth, whom half of society had already all but married to Alastair in the newspapers of gossip that pass for correspondence among the great houses. Constance was handsome, accomplished, and entirely aware of her own suitability, and she looked at Miss Calloway across the drawing-room on the evening of her arrival, the way one looks at a smudge on an otherwise clean window. "How charming," she said, when the Dowager mentioned that Flora's governess would be joining them for cards, "that you keep such an informal house, Your Grace. In London we hardly ever dine with the staff." "In the Highlands," the Dowager said, without looking up from her hand, "we dine with whoever has something worth saying, Lady Constance, which I find considerably narrows the guest list wherever I go." It was the closest I ever heard the Dowager come to open warfare, and Constance had the sense, at least, to redden and hold her tongue for the rest of the evening. But she did not hold it for good. Constance stayed a fortnight, at the Dowager's grudging insistence that a guest could not be turned out before Christmas, and in that fortnight she made it her quiet business to remind Miss Calloway, in a dozen small ways that never quite rose to the level of open cruelty, exactly what she was and was not. She commented once, within Miss Calloway's hearing but not quite to her face, on how convenient it must be for a woman of no fortune to have found a post in so grand a house, and how careful such women ought to be not to mistake a duke's ordinary courtesy for anything more particular. She had Flora's schoolroom moved, for one day, to a colder room on the pretext of draughts, until the Dowager, hearing of it, moved it back with a single icy word to the housekeeper. I do not think Miss Calloway ever answered a single one of these slights aloud. I think that was, in its way, worse for Constance than any answer could have been, because a woman who cannot be baited into defending herself cannot be made to look small, and Constance's whole strategy depended on making her look small. I happened, one gray afternoon near the end of that fortnight, to be reading in the walled garden where the hedges are tall enough to hide a man entirely, and I overheard what I believe was the only direct exchange between the two women in the whole of Constance's visit. Constance had come upon Miss Calloway walking Flora among the last of the roses, and had sent the child ahead to the fountain with a coin for the fish, ostensibly a kindness, in truth so the two of them might speak alone. "You are a clever woman, Miss Calloway, I will give you that," Constance said. "Clever enough to know that whatever attention His Grace pays you is the attention a man pays a fire on a cold night welcome, and forgotten by morning. I have seen a dozen governesses mistake a duke's courtesy for something warmer, and I have seen every one of them dismissed inside a 12-month, generally with a testimonial and very little else. I have asked His Grace for nothing, Lady Constance, and I want nothing from him beyond my wages and my situation, which I earn honestly each day I am here. I cannot answer for what you imagine you have seen, only for what I have done, which is my duty and no more. See that it remains no more." There was a silence, and then, in a voice that had lost some of its polish, Constance added, I did not come here for sport, whatever you think of me. I came because my mother wishes it, and because a woman in my position has exactly as few doors open to her as a woman in yours. Only mine are papered over with better manners. We are not so different as you would like to believe." "Perhaps not," Miss Calloway said, gently enough that I nearly did not recognize it as the same conversation. "But I would rather knock on the doors that are honestly shut than force one that was never meant to open for me at all. I wish you good fortune, Lady Constance, truly. I simply do not intend to stand aside for it." Constance said nothing further and walked back toward the house alone, and I sat very still behind my hedge for some minutes afterward, thinking that I had just heard two women fight an entire duel with nothing sharper than good grammar, and that Miss Calloway had won it without once raising her voice. Alastair saw more of it than either woman knew, because he had begun, by then, to watch Miss Calloway the way a man watches whether he has decided not to admit he is tracking. He said nothing for over a week. Then, on the last evening of Constance's visit, at a dinner where Constance had made some particularly pointed remark about governesses who forgot their place, he set down his glass with a small, final sound and said, in the voice he used for tenants who had broken an agreement, "Lady Constance, I have listened to you disparage a woman under my roof and in my care for a fortnight now, and I find I have run out of patience for it. Miss Calloway has done nothing in this house but her duty, and done it with more grace than I have seen from guests who ought to know better. I will thank you to remember for the remainder of your stay that you are a guest, and she is not merely staff. She is under my protection, as everyone under this roof is under my protection, and I do not take that lightly." The table went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone present understands, before the speaker himself perhaps understands, exactly what has just been revealed. Constance left 2 days later, a week earlier than planned, with a cold farewell and a colder letter to her mother that I am told did the family no credit in the retelling. The dowager said nothing at all, which was, from her, the loudest possible approval. Miss Calloway said only, when I found her alone in the corridor afterward looking rather pale, "He did not need to do that." "No," I agreed, "he did not need to." "Then why?" "Because he wanted to," I said, "and my friend Miss Calloway has spent a very long time not wanting anything he was willing to admit to. I should not read too much into it if I were you." I was, of course, hoping she would read everything into it, because by then I had rather fallen in love with the idea of the two of them myself, in the way a man does when he has watched his oldest friend suffer alone for years and finally sees light coming into the house. Christmas came to Kerech with snow on the moor and holly cut for the great hall, and Alastair, who for 3 Christmases running had barely marked the day beyond ordering the tenants their usual baskets, found himself, that year, standing in the schoolroom doorway on Christmas Eve watching Flora and Miss Calloway trim a small fir with paper stars, and I watched him watch them, and understood before he did that he was already lost. The dowager understood it too, and played her last card that same week. She announced, over the Christmas dinner table, with the flat authority of a woman who has decided a thing and does not intend to discuss it, that Miss Calloway's contract as governess was to be reviewed in the spring, as Flora would soon want a proper finishing tutor for older girls, and that Miss Calloway ought therefore to consider, before then, whether she wished to remain in the district at all, since positions of her kind were not so easily found in a Highland glen as in a city. I believe she meant it, in part, as a genuine kindness to a young woman's prospects, and in part, I would stake my life on this, as the final turn of the screw, because nothing moves a man to declare himself faster than the threat of losing the thing he has not yet admitted he wants. It worked exactly as she intended. Alastair did not sleep that night. I know because I did not sleep either, having drunk rather too much of his good whiskey in sympathy with a grief he had not yet named to me, and I heard him pacing the long gallery above my room until well past 3. In the morning he came to breakfast unshaven, which I had never once seen in 30 years of knowing him, and said, without preamble, I cannot let her go. Then don't, I said. It is not so simple, Thomas. She is Flora's governess. If I speak, and she does not, if she refuses me, or worse, if she accepts me only because she has nowhere else to go and no fortune to refuse a duke with, I will have done her a greater unkindness than my grandmother's cold arithmetic about contracts. I would rather lose her to Perthshire than trap her here out of want. Alasdair, I had not called him by his given name in some years, not since we buried his sister, and it startled him enough to look up. You have spent 5 months arranging your entire day around a woman who mends your niece's stockings and reads her poetry, and you defended her honor at your own table in front of a viscount's daughter your grandmother would have gladly seen you marry. I do not think the risk you are weighing is whether she wants you. I think the risk you are weighing is whether you deserve to be happy, which is an entirely different question, and one only you can answer. He did not answer me that morning, but he did not go to his ledgers either, which for Alasdair was as good as a confession. I found him an hour later standing at the long window of the gallery looking down at the schoolroom garden, empty in the December cold, and when I came to stand beside him he said, without turning, I have spent 5 years telling every mother in this county that I do not intend to marry for anything less than genuine regard, and I believed it was a fine, principled thing to say, because I never expected regard to actually arrive and demand something of me. It is easier to hold a principle when it costs you nothing. And now it costs you something. Now it costs me everything if I am wrong about her, and everything besides if I say nothing and let her go. He turned then, and I saw in his face something I had not seen since we were very young men, and he had first learned his father was dying, not fear exactly, but the particular helplessness of a man who understands, all at once, that the thing he wants most is not entirely within his power to secure by wanting it hard enough. Tell me plainly, Thomas, as my friend and not as a flatterer, have I imagined the whole of this? Have I built a cathedral out of a governess's ordinary kindness, because I was lonely enough to need one? No, I said, you have not imagined it, and if you require proof beyond your own eyes, I will tell you that the housekeeper has taken wagers below stairs since October on how long you would hold out, and I believe cook has already won a considerable sum. He laughed then briefly, the first real laugh I had heard from him in weeks, and something in his shoulders came down an inch that had been set hard since the summer his sister died. He asked his grandmother, before the week was out, to arrange one more dinner, the last of the season, she told the household, before the new year, and this time it was Alasdair himself who chose the guests, which was so unlike him that the housekeeper mentioned it to me twice. The dinner was small. The dowager, myself, Flora allowed to stay up past her hour as a treat, and Miss Calloway seated, at Alasdair's own quiet instruction, not at the foot of the table where a governess is customarily placed, but at his right hand. He waited until the last course had been cleared, and Flora, drowsing against her governess's arm, had been carried off to bed by the housekeeper. And then he stood, which no one does at a private family dinner unless they mean to say something that matters, and the dowager set down her glass with the satisfied stillness of a woman who has been waiting 5 months for exactly this moment. Miss Calloway, he said, and I noticed his hands were not quite steady, which I had not seen since the night he came home from the flood. My grandmother tells me your position here is to be reviewed in the spring, and that you may wish to consider your prospects elsewhere. I find I cannot let that stand without telling you plainly what I ought to have told you months ago, and would have, if I were half so brave as the man who swam a flooded river, rather than stay away from this house 1 night longer than he had to. Your Grace, let me finish, because I have rehearsed this rather badly and I will lose my nerve if I am interrupted. He came around the table, which was itself an astonishment, a duke crossing his own dining room to stand before a governess like a supplicant. I told Lady Constance at this same table that you were under my protection. That was true, and it was also a lie, because I do not want to protect you the way I protect a tenant or a servant. I want to protect you the way a man protects the one thing in his house he cannot imagine losing. I have watched you make my niece laugh again after I had given up hope of it. I have watched you hold your ground against every unkindness this house or this county has offered you without once losing your dignity to do it. I have watched myself become, over 5 months, a man who arranges his whole day around the hour you read poetry by a window, and I have been too great a coward to say so until my grandmother threatened to send you to Perthshire and left me no further excuse for cowardice. He knelt then, the Duke of Duncraig, on his own dining-room floor before a governess in grey wool, and took her hand as though it were the most fragile and most necessary thing he had ever held. I am not offering you a position, Miss Calloway. I am asking you to be my wife, and Flora's mother in every way but blood, and the mistress of a house that has been cold a great deal longer than the winters here account for. I am asking you to let me spend the rest of my life being worthy of the courage you have shown mine. I love you. I believe I have loved you since a storm night in October, though it has taken me a disgracefully long time to say it aloud. I have never in my life seen a room so silent, nor a woman's composure so entirely, beautifully undone. Miss Calloway Wren, as I would soon be permitted to call her, pressed her free hand to her mouth for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was not steady at all, which suited her better, I thought, than all her careful composure had done all autumn. I have no fortune, she said. No name society will thank you for. I came to this house because I had nowhere else, and I never once let myself hope for more than a kind employer and a child worth loving. Then let me be the man who gives you more than you let yourself hope for, Alasdair said. I am asking, Wren, not commanding, not settling, asking with every part of me that has been afraid of this for months. Will you have me? She said yes before he had quite finished the question, which I believe surprised her as much as it surprised him, and the dowager, watching from the head of the table with the serene satisfaction of a general who has just won a long campaign without firing a single visible shot, said only, "Well, it is about time," and called for the good champagne to be brought up from the cellar her grandson had forbidden anyone to touch since his father's death. They were married in the small stone chapel above Carrach in the first thaw of spring, with the glen still patched in snow and the first green just showing under it, and Flora walked ahead of the bride scattering winter jasmine, because it was the only thing blooming, and stood so proudly beside her uncle at the altar that half the guests wept before the vows had even begun. Lady Constance was not invited, and the dowager, seated in the first pew in a hat I am told cost more than most men's yearly wage, wept without shame through the entire ceremony, and denied it afterward to anyone who dared mention it. I stood beside Alasdair as his oldest friend, and when Wren came up the aisle in a gown the color of the first green under the snow, plain and unadorned because she had insisted on it, and he had loved her too much to argue, I watched the coldest man north of Edinburgh become, in front of the whole gathered glen, simply a man who could not stop looking at his own good fortune. He told me, years later, with Flora grown and 2 small children of his own tumbling through the halls of Carrach that had been cold for so long before her, that he had never once regretted the 5 months he spent fighting a thing his grandmother had seen coming before he had. She knew me better than I knew myself, he said of the dowager, who lived long enough to bounce her first great-grandchild on her knee and to remind Wren, at every possible opportunity, exactly whose idea the whole business had been. I have never forgiven her for being right, and I have never once thanked her enough for it either. Flora grew up under her aunt's care, for that is what Wren became to her, in every way but the word, with a head for figures that would have startled Constance's pride into silence, and a laugh that never again went quiet for want of a mother's voice in the house. She herself became mistress of a Highland estate at 19, married a shipwright's son she loved rather than a lord her uncle's rank might have arranged for her, and Alasdair, who had once told a governess that a girl had no need of arithmetic, walked his niece down the aisle himself with the ledger of her own small fortune, which Wren had taught her to keep since she was 10 years old, folded proudly in his breast pocket. Kerech itself changed slowly, the way old houses do, room by room rather than all at once. The fires that had burned low since Alastair's father died were built up again. The public rooms that had gone dim were opened for Christmases and christenings, and the ordinary noise of a family that had once been only two grieving people and a scheming grandmother rattling around too much stone. I visited every autumn still, as I always had, and every autumn there was more laughter in that house than there had been the year before, until the cold castle I remembered from my 30s seemed almost a story someone else had told me. I think of that dinner often, now that I am old myself and Alastair is gone these 2 years past, and Wren still keeps his chair at the head of the table, though she sits at the foot herself these days, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew the cold house Kerech used to be. I think of a duke who believed himself immune to any hand but his own, undone entirely by his grandmother's patience and a governess's quiet courage, and I think that if there is a lesson in it at all, it is only this, that the people who love us best can often see, long before we can bear to, exactly where our hearts have already gone, and love us enough to wait and scheme and set one more dinner until we finally catch up to what they always knew.